The first Soviet offer to the 6th Army asking it to surrender was sent on the 1st of December 1942, but Paulus ignored it. And after receiving Hitler's approval, Manstein's Army Group Don issued its orders for the Stalingrad relief operation. Manstein was hoping for the 57th Panzer Corps to begin its relief attempt on the 3rd of December, while the 48th Panzer Corps would start their attacks on the 9th. The 6th Army would also launch a breakout to the southwest, aiming to link up with the 4th Panzer Army and assist in its task of expanding the size of the corridor. Just a quick note about the name of the operation. In German it's called Wintergewitter, which means a winter thunderstorm. But this meaning is lost in the English translation, where it is often shortened to just winter storm, or sometimes winter tempest. But still, the thunder part of the thunderstorm is missing, which is important because Paulus's breakout plan was eventually called Operation Donnerschlag, Operation Thunderclap. So it was thunderstorm and thunderclap. But if you miss out the thunder part, you have winterstorm and thunderclap, which makes it sound as if these are two separate operations. Well, no, the names indicate that these two operations were meant to complement each other. A thunderclap is part of a larger thunderstorm, much like the breakout operation was part of the wider relief effort. Therefore, in this series, we're going to refer to it as Operation Winter Thunderstorm, so that the complementary nature of the two operations isn't lost upon translation. Paulus informed Manstein that he could only muster 13 or 14 panzer or motorised battalions for his breakout operation. These battalions would come from the 14th Panzer and the 3rd and 29th Motorised Divisions, although there was a chance for an additional 5 battalions to be cobbled together by the rest of the army just before the breakout was launched. Thus, at best, Paulus would have a whopping 19 battalions for his breakout operation. Effectively, Paulus had a breakout force of perhaps 2 motorised divisions worth of troops, and that's only if he received all the necessary supplies and fuel, and assuming those battalions were at full strength. This really wasn't a sufficient force to do what was needed. His army was also in dire shape. The 389th Infantry Division had 2,000 combat troops left. The 305th Infantry Division, still fighting in the Barricade Factory, had about 1,000 men left. And on the next day, the 2nd of December, the assault company of the 44th Infantry Division, fighting with the 305th Infantry Division, would be transferred back to its parent division because every man was needed in the west. This assault company had just 38 men left. Many men were also wounded, with 4,000 to 6,000 being reported trapped in the pocket at this point. Only a few hundred were being flown out of the pocket per day, and one of these was Hyacinth-Grasstrakwitz von Großsucker und Kamenetz, who was wounded at some point in late November or early December. He was reluctant to leave, but was ordered to do so by Huber, sparing him from 6th Army's fate, and allowing him to go on to fight another day. Worse, the Soviets were placing pressure on the pocket itself. Rokossovsky ordered the 21st and 65th Armies, as well as the right wing of 24th Army, to go on the offensive to test the German defences and see where the best place for the Don front to conduct its main attack was. These attacks achieved nothing, with only one hill seized from the 44th Infantry Division for a lot of casualties. Rokossovsky therefore doubled down and ordered heavy assaults for the next day, and asked Yeremenko to conduct his own supporting attacks, which he would. But Yeremenko had his eyes on the south, with General Trofanov realising that he didn't have sufficient forces to form a defensive line along the Aksay River. So he opted to attack Kotelnikova first and then establish a line there. However, his weak and exhausted forces were covering a front 140 kilometers in length with no flank protection and faced Raus's 6th Panzer Division, which, when it all arrived, would have 100 panzers and 42 Sturmgeschütz assault guns. Trofanov was therefore outmatched, which was why, when the 81st Cavalry Division tested the German defences at Kotelnikovo, it made no progress. The Soviets expected that the relief attack would come from the Don and Shur area, since this area was just 52 kilometers from the pocket. Vatutin therefore reinforced the 5th Tank Army with the 5th Mechanized Corps and transferred over the 1st Tank Corps and the 216th Tank Brigade to give the army 2 entire corps to deal with any potential German relief operation. They also launched fresh offensives, which would continue over the next couple of days to tie down Axis forces, and made some minor progress. Although it's worth noting that, with about 1,000 combat troops left, Romanian 1st Armoured Division somehow halted the attack by 47th Guards and 346th Rifle Divisions, each with more than 5,000 men. On the 2nd of December, the temperature plummeted to below freezing as Trofanov ordered Shapkin's 4th Cavalry Corps to encircle Kotelnikovo. But his troops were unable to do this because of a lack of fuel, and Trofanov had to delay the attack. And as arranged the day before, the attacks on the pocket went in again, this time with the 64th and 57th Armies helping out Rokossovsky's armies in the north. These ultimately achieved nothing except for sapping the strength of both sides, even if the Soviet 29th Rifle Division did manage to fight their way into Elki. Despite reporting that they had taken the village, they actually hadn't taken it. Still, Yenneker was worried and asked for the 129th Panzer Battalion to reinforce the line. The panzers set off and became immobilised in a gully, and special cleats for their tracks had to be flown in overnight to get the battalion moving again. They weren't the only ones suffering from the weather though, as this account from the 24th Rifle Division shows. There was no vegetation, water or lodgings in the region, but on the other hand it abounded in dry gullies and ravines. Supplying water and heat to the subunits, and especially the medical points, represented a particularly difficult problem. The temperature approached up to -42 degrees centigrade, -44 degrees Fahrenheit. The soldiers were in sheepskin coats, felt boots, quilted trousers and jackets, and caps with ear flaps. But the cold gripped the men. The biting but ultimately fruitless attacks on the pocket continued on the 3rd of December as the temperature rose from the day before. It was still freezing however, and there was a blizzard. Hauptmann Loser, yes, of the 76th Infantry Division, reported on the situation. The first cases of exhaustion, frost and hunger occur. They are indicated by fainting fits, apathy, delirium, low body temperature, and very weak pulse. Reserves are attached to the units. They are badly clothed and fed, and in their demeanour compare badly with earlier times. The bulk of the cases of theft from comrades, mainly rations, is carried out by this lot. Every day the battalion loses some 6 to 7 men who report sick to the main casualty clearing station. During the fighting, Marianovka was set ablaze, and the 103rd Panzer Battalion in 3rd Motorised Division lost 10 panzers and 2 Marders in fierce tank action against the 4th Tank Corps. The good news was that all but one of the panzers was soon repaired, and the hill in the west that the Soviets had captured 2 days previously was now recaptured by the Germans, showing that the Axis were not giving up without a fight. Therefore, Rokossovsky ordered his Don front to halt its attacks to rest and refit, with Chuikov forced to do the same late that evening. After delaying because of fuel, Trofanov's attack began on the 3rd, but not all of it. Only the 81st Cavalry Division and the 85th Tank Brigade would actually advance, and managed to capture Polkabin from the 6th Panzer Division for the cost of just 6 tanks. The Soviets obviously believed that they had won when their 2 leading tanks reached the centre of the town, but the last gunner of the sole surviving anti-tank gun destroyed them as well. 6 tall black columns of smoke indicated the total losses that the enemy had suffered at the hands of 3 anti-tank gun crews who had perished to the last man in an unequal fight. I should point out for anyone doing their own reading that 6th Panzer Division's commander, Raus, got the dates wrong in his memoirs, and then also put several days of events into a couple of days. Glantz explains that both Soviet and German sources confirm that this action at Pokobin occurred on the 3rd to 4th, not the 5th and 6th. So if you're reading Rouse, you need to be aware of this. Yet another example of why memories and memoirs are flawed. Realising that he was facing the 6th Panzer Division, which his forces were ill-equipped to deal with, Shapkin requested permission to withdraw. Probably because of pressure from above, Trifonov rejected the request and ordered him to continue the attack the next day, which wasn't good because the 11th Panzer Regiment was currently coming off its trains at Kotelnikovo. In the west, Kramer's 48th Panzer Corps was transferred to 4th Panzer Army's control on the 3rd of December and started its move to Kampfgruppe Adams area in preparation for its relief operation. And late on the 3rd, Stalin signed a Stavka directive that approved Operation Saturn, the attack on the Italian sector in the west, as well as Army Group Hollet. The start date would be on the 10th of December, or so he thought. The Sixth Army would have to be relieved before Operation Saturn began, otherwise Saturn would force the Axis to cancel their relief operation and send their panzer forces west. Thus, Manstein had to get his act together, and the Luftwaffe had to ramp up their airlift efforts to give Paulus the best chance of relief. But would they be able to do this? Let's find out. In the final days of November, the airlift had struggled. Heavy caliber artillery ammunition wasn't being flown in at all, and the number of shells being allocated to each light battery in the 6th Army had been set at 16 rounds. Heavy infantry guns were given just 2 rounds. And infantry ammunition wasn't being rationed just yet, but that would most likely change as the 6th Army was slowly eating away at its dwindling reserves. Still, the number of tons was increasing, as were the number of aircraft available, and we concluded last time that they only needed 150 to 200 aircraft to deliver the minimum 300-ton target. Well, up until the 30th of November, they didn't have the aircraft to do this, and so failed to deliver the goods. However, the number of aircraft was growing. They started off with 42 aircraft on the 24th of November, delivering 84 tons. This was actually higher than the next few days when they delivered 66 tons, 72 or 50 tons, and 28 tons. Not good. In fact, we'd say things were getting worse. But then on the 28th they found 55 aircraft all of a sudden and delivered either 28, 45 or 101 tons, depending on the source. This might be the first time they delivered over 100 tons, but 6th Army seems to be recording fewer tons than were being sent, either suggesting that planes were being shot down or that goods were being pilfered by the troops before they were registered in the pocket. Either way, on the 29th, 29 or 40 aircraft delivered 46 or 60 tons, and the second time they delivered over 100 tons occurred on the 30th, when 98 aircraft delivered 100, 129 or 161 tons depending on the source. So far, the airlift had only delivered in November a total of about 300 tons, the amount promised for a single day. But they still hadn't sent up over 100 aircraft yet, although they were close on the 30th. So it makes sense to imagine that if they started sending between 150 and 200 aircraft, that they'd actually hit the required tonnages. And on the 2nd of December, 4th Air Fleet mustered 200 transport aircraft. So surely then, they would start sending up at least 100 of these, right? You know, we should see the numbers increase over the next few days. But no, that's not what we see. On the 1st of December, 35 or 40 aircraft delivered 85 or 89 tons depending on the source. On the 2nd, just 70 were sent up, delivering either 120 or 150 tons. Even though 36 aircraft did take off, no tons were delivered on the 3rd due to the weather, since they were forced to turn back or were shot down, and only 74 aircraft were sent up on the 4th, delivering either 141 or 143 tons, this being the first time Italian aircraft were involved in the airlift. And just 29 or 36 aircraft went up on the 5th in almost completely blind weather conditions, and only 61 tons delivered. Even as late as the 6th, just 44 aircraft delivered 72.9 tons. What's interesting is that in the final 7 days of November, the average number of tons per day was 75, depending on the source. Yet, despite gathering a lot more aircraft, the average number of tons in the first 6 days of December only increased to about 80 tons per day. They failed to deliver any supplies on the 3rd of December, but even without this setback, the average number of tons would have been about 96 tons, which again is very low. They have enough aircraft to deliver 300 tons by the 2nd, yet only managed an average of 96 if we don't count the day that they couldn't fly. So what's going on here? Why were so few aircraft being sent up into the skies? The weather plays its part, but that isn't the only reason. In Bergstrom's Black Cross Red Star, it's clear that Soviet resistance was beginning to mount, and as a result, losses were being sustained in the transport wings. This would become a significant factor in the near future, but Glan says that the Soviets were surprised by the airlift and weren't prepared to take it on until after the reorganisation effort initiated on the 5th had occurred. Therefore, Soviet resistance on its own doesn't explain why they're not sending up more of their available aircraft at this point. The mystery is why the Germans weren't getting their planes into the sky, and there's only a handful of potential reasons for this. It's not a lack of escorts. In fact, the slow-moving transport aircraft may have actually been hindered by their fighter escorts. The transports flew low to the ground in ones or in small groups, and used the cover of the clouds and fog and snow to sneak past the Soviet defences. From the accounts, this seems like the best strategy, but German fighters circling above them would attract Soviet interceptors to the area, who would then swoop down on the helpless transports. So it wasn't a lack of escorts, and the bad weather could actually help them once they were in the air, as long as it wasn't too bad. Even grounding Soviet fighters while the transports continued delivering supplies. Logistics, getting supplies to the airfield so they can be delivered, is a factor that we've covered before, and obviously influenced by the weather. But one issue that might be something to consider is disorganisation. Speaking from experience, setting up a brand new logistical transport enterprise is chaotic, even with the most experienced people. It's not hard to imagine that with hundreds of new pilots and planes being flown into the area that they've never been to before, some experienced, some fresh out of pilot school, who don't know where the canteen is, maybe there's not enough bedding for them, maybe there's not enough officers to get them up to speed or to organise them, and perhaps there's not enough personnel or equipment on the airfields to load up their planes or clear the runways of snow, and they've never flown the routes before, so maybe they're nervous and don't want to go, etc, etc. You can envision a lot of idle hands and people not sure what to do. Now, some of this will be the fault of the commanders, but a lot of it will just be because of the nature of the beast. It's not easy, even for experienced commanders, to keep things organised when you're setting up something new like this, especially with limited resources. And we actually do have hints in the narrative that this was a problem. There was no time for the crews to become fully accustomed to conditions gradually. They had to be employed fully right from the start. The harshness of the winter cold, the long and dangerous approach and return flights over enemy territory in the face of heavy fighter and anti-aircraft artillery defences, the constant enemy bombardment of take-off and landing fields, the unloading and loading in the encirclement area while constantly harassed by artillery fire and grenades, and the ever-present danger of icing and other technical failures in the bitter cold all combined to make the situation faced by the transport personnel a very difficult one. In addition, there was the psychological depression they were bound to feel at the sight of the half-starved troops in the encircled area, and of the countless numbers of wounded personnel, many of whom had to be left behind because there was not sufficient space available to fly them out. It is no wonder that young and inexperienced crews were badly shaken by what they saw. It would be unfair to reproach them for this. Yeah, we can't blame the individuals here, but the overall effect may have been a reluctance to take to the air, and an unwillingness to actually get the job done when on the ground. Hayward mentions that the ground personnel were overtaxed when clearing snow from the runways and keeping the plane engines warm, suffering from a lack of the necessary maintenance equipment, partly because some of it had been abandoned during the Soviet advance. Still, there were more hints besides. Viktor Karganenko had been in charge of the airlift until the 29th of November, when Fiebig had taken over. Why was he replaced? Because Karganenko and his staff were too inexperienced to deal with air supply operations. The fact that he was replaced suggests that he hadn't got to grips with the situation, and that there was disorganisation at the airfields. Richthofen wrote exactly this on the 28th of November. Air supply leader Karganenko is not working out, despite constant and detailed exhortations. I wrestle mentally with command and supply organisation problems, but after much debating to and fro, I arrive at the following solution. Flieger Corps 8 will take over the Stalingrad Airlift. And just because Fiebig took over doesn't mean that everything would have instantly gone smoothly. At best, it would have taken days for his commands to have taken effect, and in reality probably weeks, if ever. Plus, the guys underneath him, Colonels Kuhl, Forster and Major Villas, were in command of the airfields and retained their positions, so potentially they may have been overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the enterprise and, of course, the weather. After yesterday's snowfall, everything is still frozen. We can get the HE-111s airborne, but not the Ju-52s before 11:30 hours. We lack heating equipment. We did not receive enough to cope with the large influx of aircraft. Transport planes simply have no business here. Thawing takes too much time and a great deal of effort. 2 days later he wrote, "Everyone is stressed, standing by for a chance to get airborne. Everyone, ground and air personnel, is doing his utmost, but who can fight the forces of nature?" I will point out that people don't tend to criticise themselves in their own diaries, and so Fiebig sticks to talking about the weather rather than any disorganisation issue. But it does appear that disorganisation was as much an issue as anything else, even if it's difficult to prove. Hayward notes that the ground crews inside the pocket were very efficient at the start, able to process incoming planes within 2 hours, if all went well, but that this level of efficiency waned as their strength and morale were sapped over time. However, the big clues come later, and I don't really want to reveal what those clues are too early, but Manstein hints at this sort of problem in his memoirs. He openly blames Goering, saying Goering didn't do everything he could have done to get the airlift up and running. And what was Goering doing? Organising the airlift, suggesting that it wasn't organised. When Milch took over in mid-January, things started to happen, but again, I don't want to go into that just yet. Instead, I will give a quote from Manstein, who's talking about the setting up of Army Group Don at this point. Since we lacked a Quartermaster General's branch, we were to be joined by the one already formed for Marshal Antonescu. It was headed by Colonel Fink, a General Staff officer whose soundness of character was matched only by his extraordinary talent for organising supply and transport, and who, in due course, mastered all the supply difficulties with which the army group constantly found itself confronted. The airlift to 6th Army, unfortunately, was outside of his control. Is Manstein suggesting that the guys in charge of the airlift didn't have Fink's soundness of character, or an extraordinary talent for organising supply and transport, and didn't master all the supply difficulties? Is he suggesting that the organisers of the airlift weren't up to scratch, or at least it was a disorganised mess, and only someone with extraordinary talent could have organised it properly? It's also not Fiebig or Karganico he's referring to here, but someone else we'll come back to in the next episode. I will point out though that Manstein wasn't entirely truthful in this passage. It turns out that the army group was the one submitting 6th Army supply requests to the Luftwaffe, and that an army group liaison officer was at every airfield involved in the airlift. These officers each ran a supply detail in charge of packing and loading the aircraft as well as unloading the wounded. The sources say that the coordination was good, but that doesn't mean it was effective. Speaking of Manstein though, the original plan for Operation Winter Thunderstorm called for 2 relief attacks, one from the Don bridgehead and the other from Kotelnikovo. The German line at the Don was less than 60 kilometers from the Stalingrad pocket, and Kotelnikovo was 120 kilometers away. In the end, Manstein couldn't get enough forces to conduct both attacks, and 48th Panzer Corps was bogged down fighting 5th Tank Army, so the Kotelnikovo axis was the only one that actually went in. But people have asked, why didn't Manstein just take the 57th Panzer Corps, move it to the Don area, and strike from there, rather than start so far away from Stalingrad? I mean, spoiler, his relief attack ended up going 70 kilometers, so if he had launched it from the Don area, 60 kilometers from the pocket, then he would have reached the 6th Army, right? Well, Manstein himself actually answers this, sort of. In the circumstances, the original idea of relieving 6th Army from 2 different directions would be invalidated by the shortage of forces. The most we could hope to do now was to assemble sufficient strength in one spot. As things stood, this left only 4th Panzer Army eligible for the attack. It had a shorter mileage to cover to Stalingrad, and did not have an obstacle like the Don to negotiate. It was also reasonable to hope that the last quarter from which the enemy would expect a relief offensive was anywhere east of the Don, as the whole situation made it extremely risky for the Germans to assemble large forces in that area. For the very same reason, he had initially put out relatively weak forces in the direction of Kotelnikovo for protection of his siege front. Here, for the time being, 4th Panzer Army was faced with only 5 enemy divisions, whereas the enemy on the Cher had already 15 divisions in the line. I didn't understand why he thought the mileage to Stalingrad was shorter from Kotelnikovo than from the Don, so I instantly assumed that this was some sort of mistake. I double-checked with another English edition of Manstein's Lost Victories, and they both say the same thing. So then I checked a German copy that I found online and discovered that, according to Google Translate, the bit about the mileage being shorter from Kotelnikovo wasn't in there. Or at least, I can't see it. So this might be a mistranslation. If anyone who can speak German is watching this and can verify this with their copy of Lost Victories, that would be great. But yes, I can't see this mileage point in the German text. The rest of Manstein's explanation makes sense though. I will also point out that if the 57th Panzer Corps was pulled out of the line in the south, then there would be nothing to stop the Soviets racing off to Rostov. So at least one of the mobile divisions had to be there unless significantly more reinforcements were received, which they weren't. However, Manstein again wasn't being entirely honest. His account makes it sound like he made the decision himself, but it wasn't him. It was 4th Panzer Army's commander, General Hott, who objected to the attack coming from the Don and Cher areas, pleading instead for the Kotelnikovo axis. The reasons were the same, but Manstein was reluctant to agree to Hoth's arguments, even though he did in the end, just simply because reality dictated it. On the 4th, the Soviets attacked the Schur Line once more, and 48th Panzer Corps had to be used to stabilise the front, thus preventing its use in the relief operation. What I find interesting though is that Hoth had covered this exact ground before in the summer, and should have known that it had taken him from the 1st of August until the first week of September to go the same distance. He should have known that going the same distance in the winter at a faster pace with fewer units on top of that just simply isn't possible. Plus, things have started to go from bad to worse. Manstein had hoped to launch his attack on the 3rd, but this didn't happen, and it was put back till about the 8th. Huge delays in transporting the divisions to the front, mainly because of the weather, but also because of the inefficiencies in the German railway system, meant that he had to postpone the offensive. But the delay was also caused by the OKH's and Hitler's decision to keep the 17th Panzer Division in Army Group B's reserve until after the relief attempt had been started. This would leave him with just the 6th and 23rd Panzer Divisions when the latter arrived, plus infantry forces to mount his relief attempt, which would probably not be adequate. It is a sign of how low German fighting strength in the theatre had sunk that out of the entire Wehrmacht, Manstein could assemble a single corps, just 2 divisions, for the relief offensive. Thus, at a time when the 6th Army was eating away its stocks of food and ammunition and the Luftwaffe was failing to send up its planes into the skies, Manstein was struggling to assemble the forces he needed to mount his counter-attack. Time was slowly ticking away to rescue the situation at Stalingrad, and every day was making success ever more unlikely. On the 4th of December, the news floated about the German lines inside Stalingrad saying that the siege was over, the relief force had come, and that from the next day the food ration would be back to normal. It was soon discovered that this was only a rumour, crushing morale at this delicate time. But the good news for the Germans was that it was clear now that Rokossovsky's Don front and Yeremenko's Stalingrad front would not be able to tackle the larger than expected 6th Army. Therefore, Stalin approved Vasilevsky's plan to use Malinovsky's 2nd Guards Army to help out, which would hopefully arrive on the 10th. In the meantime, Yeremenko and Rokossovsky kept attacking the pocket in order to weaken their enemy, and given the weather, the terrain, and the fact that the Germans were dug into formidable positions and still being supplied to some extent, this task was easier said than done. Rokossovsky's forces attacked once more, with several hills being taken, most being quickly lost again, but the main effort was against the 44th Infantry Division at Hill 124.5. Here a small protrusion was formed by the 27th Guards and 24th and 304th Rifle Divisions, with support from the 91st and 121st Tank Brigades, and the advance almost succeeded in penetrating the line. The Germans had to scramble to find a counter-attacking force, which they ultimately wouldn't do until the next day. After detraining at Kotelnikovo, the 150 tanks of 11th Panzer Regiment attacked the 81st Cavalry Division just as they were beginning their own advance. The Soviet cavalrymen were caught off guard, had no chance anyway, and were quickly overwhelmed. Gripped by paralysing terror, the Soviets suddenly saw more than 200 tanks and armoured vehicles descend from the hills and fall upon their columns. From close range, 200 guns opened fire on tanks, artillery and vehicles. Flames shot up, columns of black smoke from tanks that had been hit rose into the sky, trucks were overturned and burning. 300 machine guns took a terrible toll among riders and horses. Those who escaped this inferno tried to get across the river, but the thin ice broke. Men, tanks and equipment disappeared into the cold waters. The 81st Cavalry Division was surrounded at Pokkelbin by 1400 hours, had their pockets squeezed by panzers and panzer grenadiers, and after a hard day's fighting in the village, the Soviet division was obliterated, with small groups of survivors managing to slip the noose by wading through the marshes in the area. The remains of the 81st Cavalry Division and 85th Tank Brigade withdrew north, with 6th Panzer Division chasing them, hurting them even more, after which they entrenched in new defensive positions. At least 2,000 men, but possibly 3,500 were killed, wounded or captured, and 2,000 horses were captured by the Germans as well, with perhaps as many as 56 Soviet tanks destroyed. 6th Panzer Division lost 8 men killed, 28 wounded, and 12 panzers totally lost, with 5 more out of action due to technical reasons. Colonel Baumstein was killed, along with his chief of staff and his commissar, and the remnants of the 81st Cavalry Division would be leaderless for the next 10 days. Azarov was wounded and would soon be replaced as well, since half his brigade had been lost. Shapkin's cavalry corps was effectively put out of action, and this was a stunning reversal for the Soviets. However, Shapkin still ordered the 61st Cavalry Division to continue its advance on Kotelnikovo from the east, probably trying to distract 6th Panzer Division from devouring what was left of the other division. With 1 in 6 of Trofanov's combat formations gone and half his tanks, he had no choice but to appeal to Yeremenko and Vasilevsky for help, and the result was that Tanishchin's 13th Tank Corps plus 4 more units would soon be sent to the 51st Army, arriving on the 9th. This defeat also prompted the Stavka to form the 5th Shock Army the next day, so Raus's one division had already had a huge operational impact, even though it had only just arrived. Overnight on the 5th of December 1942, the temperature dropped to around freezing, and up to 20 centimeters (7.8 inches) of snow fell on the ground, causing all sorts of problems for the units on the ground and in the air. In the west, Kramer was replaced as commander of the 48th Panzer Corps by Lieutenant General Otto von Knobelsdorff. The former commander, General Heim, was now coming under intense pressure from the Führer, with Hitler on the 5th of December issuing an exhaustive critique of 48th Panzer Corps' performance. He was convinced that the reason the lines had broken was because of the 48th Panzer Corps. Back to the south of Stalingrad, the 126th Rifle Division had caught up to the 302nd Rifle Division, and so the 51st Army could now set up a weak defence line in the area. Even so, there was a 10-kilometre gap between the 126th and 91st Rifle Divisions, and Trofanov was still trying to get 61st Cavalry Division to attack towards Kotelnikovo with 254th Tank Brigade. The attacks on the pocket went in again, achieving nothing of note as usual. But there was a change in the south, with the 422nd and 169th Rifle Divisions being transferred to the 64th Army. But apart from that, no ground was taken. And at Hill 124.5, the Germans had found the counter-attacking force they were looking for. The 177th Sturmgeschütz Battalion, Panzer Jagddetachment Langenthal, plus additional infantry reinforcements, struck from the south, as the 17 tanks from Zicenius's Panzer Regiment from 14th Panzer Division hit it from the north and east. Soviet tanks operating without close rifle support were sitting ducks, and an entire company of tanks and infantry were encircled and destroyed, which drove back the Soviet line. Despite all this, the Red Army held on to Hill 124.5, and the 177th Sturmgeschütz Battalion was down to just 9 Stugs left by the end of the day. Zicenius lost 5 of his 17 tanks, bringing him down to just 12 panzers as well, and the total casualties for the 14th Panzer Division alone were 33 men killed, 84 wounded and 6 missing, so this was a costly battle just to hold back the Soviets on their western front. Still, the failure of this Soviet offensive was enough to convince Rokossovsky that he couldn't destroy the pocket until the 2nd Guards Army arrived, and until after the battles along the outer encirclement lines ended and a possible German relief effort was defeated. This was good news in some way though, because time was on the Soviet side. The pocket was closed and it was down to the Germans to make their move, which ultimately they would. And back in Stalingrad, a slogan was making the rounds of the troops within the pocket. "Hold out, the Führer will get you out." In the meantime, men with jaundice were being sent back to the frontline units from the field hospitals, and new cases had to stay at the front, indicating how desperate the manpower and medical crisis was in the 6th Army. The men were bartering their valuables for food, and their worthless currency wasn't accepted anymore by anyone. Morale was boosted for the beleaguered men though, as Manstein's message was read to the troops. "Acknowledge your defensive achievements. Our help to you is certain." The next day, Paulus sent a report to Army Group Don stating that there were, at this time, still 275,000 men in the pocket. 11,000 of these were Romanian troops and 20,300 were Russian auxiliaries, plus other attached troops, leaving just 243,700 Germans. And while the 6th Army had 180 tanks and 30 assault guns, only 100 to 120 of these tanks and assault guns were operational on any given day. They had also suffered 14,796 casualties since the 21st of November. The good news was that there was a lull in the fighting, as Rokossovsky's front was now resting and refitting in preparation for their planned upcoming offensive. So the 6th Army was able to solidify their defences and attempt to eliminate the protrusion in their line by recapturing Hill 124.5. Several small units, mainly from the 44th Infantry with the disbanded 384th Infantry Division subordinated, and 14th Panzer Divisions, wrestled with the 24th Rifle Division, who had by now dug in on the hill. But despite some local successes, the hill remained in Soviet hands. Also on this day, a battle group from the 16th Panzer Division was sent into a counterattack against another hill on foot because they had no fuel for their armoured reconnaissance cars. When Soviet tanks appeared, the Germans were caught off guard and without anti-tank guns or artillery. The Soviets quickly tried to encircle the stricken unit. The Germans panicked and fled, and half of the group were wiped out. So I guess it's not just the Romanians who suffered from tank fright at Stalingrad. Both sides remained passive in the south, building up their strength in preparation for a future fight. That said, the Soviet commanders were distracted by events elsewhere, and Trofanov sent a string of messages to Yeremenko asking for reinforcements. Ultimately, the first week of December 1942 saw both sides facing immense problems, bringing up fresh reserves and trying to consolidate their lines. Time, though, was on the Soviet side, and with each passing day, Paulus and his 6th Army were slowly succumbing to the pressure that was all around them. Could they hold out until Manstein launched his counter-offensive? And would Manstein be able to launch it on the 8th, as he hoped? We'll find out next time. Thanks for watching, bye for now.